Professor Kastenberg, you were twice deployed to Iraq, if my research is correct, as part of the Judge Advocate General or Judge Service. Part of your job, interestingly enough, was to ensure compliance with international law.
Yes.
Tell me a bit about that work, please.
So on my first deployment, as Iraq is rebuilding, we're helping them rebuild their criminal justice system. And we were assisting in the prosecution of individuals accused of local area terrorists, Al-Qaeda Iraq or the Shiite equivalent of that, or others who had been murdering judges, doctors, blowing up, a nursing school, things like that. And then, of course, there was the trial of Saddam Hussein. And so we had a little bit of a role in assisting in motion writing and the like to ensure that that particular trial was not a kangaroo court. The Nuremberg tribunals, some isolationists like Joe McCarthy in the late 40s and 50s accused Nuremberg of being a kangaroo court.
He accused a lot of people of a lot of things.
He certainly did. He certainly did. My second deployment, though, when I had been promoted as a lieutenant colonel and I headed up a legal team, we did the ordinary things of court-martialing our troops who had been involved in crimes, looked at some contract malfeasance allegations, investigating those, did training for the Iraqis on rule of law, some more of that, but also investigated contractor malfeasance, where American civilians had engaged in acts that violated the rule of law, international law. We call it the law of armed conflict, or LOAC, which is really based on both custom and the Geneva Conventions and the older conventions. So we ran a number of investigations throughout Iraq, and some of them handed over to state, some handed to the FBI, especially the contract malfeasance. That's not really our specialty, but the rule of law was, and so that's what we did.
Okay, you mentioned international law. I want to talk for a moment about war crimes.
Yes.
Folks are hearing that phrase get battered around an awful lot in the press and around the dinner table these days as well. How and by whom are war crimes defined?
Well, war crimes come about based off of the Nuremberg principles that the Nazi leadership was charged with. Also, crimes that were prosecuted in lower courts, such as the United States military trial of General Yamashita that was brought before the Supreme Court, a failure to stop their troops from committing tens of thousands of murders throughout the Philippines. And then, of course, there's our Uniform Code of Military Justice, which only applies to service members, but not the civilian leadership. So the president, in theory, is supposed to comply with the UCMJ, but is not required to by any constitutional construct. So what a war crime basically is, and there are many things. One, the use of weapons that have been banned. So there's several weapons that have been banned. In theory, nuclear warfare would be a war crime violation, particularly a first use. Maybe a response wouldn't be, because there's this theory of proportionality that applies. Targeting has to be as precise as possible with an intent to minimize the harms committed to non-combatant civilian populations. That's another one. Proportionality. You don't drop a nuclear bomb to take out a sniper or send in a B-52. You have to be able to protect the population. And then those people who are caught, prisoners of war who fought, or civilian populations who are within the control of the United States and their allies, they have to be treated in a dignified manner. So there's a host of that. Even the protection of cultural properties. So, you'll hear there were thousands of war crimes committed in Vietnam, and that may be true. We're familiar with My Lai. There's also an obligation to prosecute those war crimes, which is also true. There were hundreds of court-martials which were not held in war crimes tribunals, but were levied against soldiers, Marines, airmen, and sailors for committing them in Vietnam.
You mentioned the Uniform Code. Who else determines war crimes? Are there other authorities?
Oh, sure. So there are some statutes in the U.S. Criminal Code, like the Torture Prevention Act, which could be a war crime if it were committed by a civilian in the war crime context. Then there's the Geneva Conventions. There's the International Criminal Tribunal. And some countries like Belgium assert this idea of universal jurisdiction. So they threaten Henry Kissinger as an example, or Bibi Netanyahu, as an example of war crimes. That one isn't tested particularly well because Americans seem to never fall into the trap of that. And there
are treaties we don't sign.
Well, there are. Yeah, absolutely. There are international criminal tribunals we set up, like Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Rwanda, but we are not a party to the ICC, which is problematic, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I share that opinion. Professor, there is a perspective that all wars are crimes. How does that strike you?
I think that's an overstatement. I think there's a right to defense. I think there's a right to collective self-defense. And I believe that, wars can be quite diabolical. You can't name a war without human suffering or human rights violations. But I'll give an example of a military conflict I think was done for an ethical purpose. It's India's invasion into East Pakistan. The Pakistanis were massacring parts of their population, huge numbers. And today the country we know as Bangladesh comes out of that because India has a refugee problem on its border, and India sends in military forces to stop it. Stopping the Igbo rebellion in Nigeria would have been a wonderful thing to do. The use of the military in Yugoslavia, to me, was eminently supportable against to put an end to the ethnic cleansing. An invasion of a NATO country, an invasion of South Korea, the Republic of Korea by the North or China, I think that we would be on solid footing to do that. I take the Augustinian view of just war theory and I'll put it in the modern context, and I think some of the use of the military is justified, but much of it is not.
Let's move back to Iran for just a moment. Yeah. I'm certain that you follow this at least as closely as I do. Have you seen evidence in Iran to date of the United States committing what you would describe as war crimes?
Well, the threat to annihilate an entire civilization,
You're talking about the Truth Social post from the president.
Oh, yeah. To me, there are some of my colleagues who I respect a great deal say that is a war crime. Period. My view of it is it opens the door to war crimes. It should have been immediately retracted and not made with the excuse of the president speaks in this type of bluster. Mm-hmm. To me, it enabled war crimes to occur. The attack on Iran itself, which was made with which was done in an aconstitutional or unconstitutional fashion. Every killing of a civilian that comes out of that has to have a suspicion of being a war crime because it failed to follow the rule of law. You can inadvertently or accidentally kill non-combatants, including kids in war, without it being a war crime. That's possible. The international law construct allows for that kind of mistake. It also allows for the idea that if a foreign country puts a missile factory over an elementary school or a hospital or proximity, they're the ones that forfeited the protection. But if you threaten to annihilate an entire civilization, you can't follow your own domestic law, then you're on the hook for the burden of proof to be on you to prove it's not a war crime.
It's predicated on intentionality and someone else being at fault for the death of civilians.
But at the end of the day, I use the Yamashita or Yamashita precedent. The president is supposed to hold his forces accountable. We created that precedent under a court convened by no less than General Douglas MacArthur, in which the Supreme Court refused to intervene. That precedent is the leadership of the military has a duty to create an environment where war crimes do not occur and to hold those accountable when it does. And I think of the president's prior pardons, and I think of the will annihilate a civilization. I think of the our way or the highway attitude that was taken in this, and I think that there have been war crimes.
Professor, I would be remiss to have a conversation with you about war crimes without talking about what's happening in Gaza. The word genocide is pretty liberally thrown around at this point. There are a number of international bodies that have proclaimed what's happening in Gaza to be a genocide. I wonder what you make of that designation for what's happening in that part of the world.
To me, the term genocide is the intentional effort to wipe out an entire culture, an entire population of peoples based on their race, their ethnicity, their religion. What I can say, what I'm absolutely confident of about the Gaza invasion, it is a massive war crime. It was not required by the situation that was involved, the Hamas attack on Israel. Clearly, Israel had some right to respond. They could have done what happened after the Munich Games. They could have gotten international agreement to have an international force go in to Gaza. But the toll in human suffering in Gaza, the numbers of civilians that have been killed, that is a massive war crime. It goes to intent. I have some colleagues who throw the term Gaza around, the term genocide around quite liberally, not only in Gaza, but in Iran or in other conflicts. And I think that is an important debate to have in the future when the emotion is taken out of the mix and objectivity is put in. But in no way am I excusing the Israeli military conduct in Gaza.
Do you believe the United States is complicit in war crimes in Gaza?
Well, you have an ally, and you're obligated, I think, under international law to restrain your ally where you can. And I don't believe that the United States has exercised its ability to restrain the Israelis. And in fact, we're allying with them. But I do want to put on a caveat in what I'm saying. It's a difficult question because you only have as much intelligence as you have when you're not part of the inner circle.
You're not getting briefings every day.
No, I'm not getting briefings. And I believe in the right of a Palestinian state to exist. I do. And I believe in the right of an Israeli state to exist. I'm not making an argument that any side has forfeited any of those rights. But I think the Trump administration has leaned heavily on the side of supporting Israel, so that I'm not convinced that the United States is restraining Israel in the manner that it could be doing or should be doing. I think in terms of Israel, if Netanyahu loses the election, we should see what recriminations occur in terms of the courts of Israel for his government and to happen. So we'll see what they do.
Professor Kastenberg, unfortunately, I don't think this is the last time we'll be discussing these issues on my show. I hope you'll come back sometime soon.
Anytime you'd like. I'll be happy to come back.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.